In December, the White House announced big news. The U.S. would normalize relations with Cuba after a 50-year stalemate. Entrepreneurs Ric Herrero and Natalia Martinez are both of Cuban descent. They joined Mary Louise to talk what this thawing means for entrepreneurs on both sides of the Atlantic.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Somebody's left their white phone to match our new white sofas. Well, it's turned off, so that's at least the good news.
Yeah.
Welcome to you both. So we are here to talk about one of the biggest changes since we last gathered a year ago in Miami for this conference, which is the thawing of relations in Cuba, something you two follow closely. To get everybody caught up on the same page, as we just heard, here's where we are in the situation. President Obama announced in December his decision to, after a half-century hiatus, reestablish relations with Cuba. The wheels are grinding, but they grind slowly. The trade embargo is still being enforced. There were hopes that by April, Cuba would have an embassy opening in Washington. Washington would have an embassy opening in Havana. That has not happened, and April is in, what, 2 days? So we'll see. And meanwhile, there are so many practical hurdles to trying to figure out how these two countries are going to work together and do business together. I mean, just to take as a beginning marker the fact that 9 in 10 Cubans don't have access to a mobile phone. The majority of Cubans have never been online. Forget don't have high-speed access at home, they have never been online. So let me start with both of you, Natalia and Ric, and ask, what are the signs you are watching for as you watch these diplomatic wheels slowly churning? What signs to see that we're actually seeing improvement in the lives of ordinary Cubans? Natalia.
So from my end, I think you're very right in saying that the wheels are turning extremely slowly. For me, partly because of the areas that I personally focus on, there are particular wheels that are kind of not just symbolic, but to see kind of what it is that happens in that space is very powerful. Specifically, you alluded to the fact that Cuba is the least connected country in the Western Hemisphere, which remains a fact. So the conversation around technology, and more specifically particular aspects of technology, is for me, is a crucial marker. Whether or not, we've seen from both sides of the conversation around technology and telecommunications and access to the internet is on the table for discussion and is on the table during the negotiations. What will that actually mean? How will that affect whether an ordinary person has or does not have access to the internet? How will that affect the import of technological goods or telecommunication services or their ability to connect with the outside world? So for me, kind of the fact that conversation around technology is a little bit more open is great. The fact that that has been mentioned is great. What will actually happen on that space is incredibly important, because almost no other change will really resonate in the way that we would like it to resonate if Cuba remains disconnected from the rest of the region and the rest of the world in a technological aspect.
Ric, you're nodding. Weigh in here.
No, I totally agree. I think the two more interesting or important developments since the thaw between the U.S. and Cuba is, number one, now, when it comes to Cuba, the term engagement is no longer a four-letter word. For so many years, Cuba was just a place that seemed off-limit to Americans. To many Americans, because it was so hard to travel there. You could barely do business there unless it was selling food or medicine, and also it was very politically charged, right? But what we've seen over the course of the years is that it's an issue that the embargo has lost faith among the American public as a vehicle to help promote change in the island, including among Cuban Americans, and more people are embracing engagement as a way to help promote change as opposed to isolation. So now that we're in this place where we're finally engaging, we're embarking on we're having talks to normalize relations, here comes the really hard work. As we start lifting through this morass of overlapping sanctions that have been piled on over 50 years, where are the opportunities? How does each one of those opportunities present itself? And I think that here's where you're going to see entrepreneurs really lead the charge and help define where the outer limits of this relationship is. Because you still have a lot of these sanctions in place that can only be removed from Congress. On the Cuban side, it's still a very challenging business environment. There's very little infrastructure of any of the sort that you need to be able to conduct modern business. There's very little telecoms infrastructure, very little transport and logistic infrastructure to ship goods to and fro throughout the island. the island still lacks the legal framework to offer the sort of protections that attract foreign investors and other entrepreneurs
to feel that their money is going to be safe.
Yeah.
So huge
but
challenges.
But there are areas that are opening up and where there is opportunity, particularly with this growing sector of entrepreneurs inside the island. Over 490 of them licensed right now to operate in Cuba. They're incredibly resourceful people. Cubans are masters of invention, something that's been honed through decades of privation. And they find many ways to find where the opportunities are. As soon as you see an opening in Cuba, they seize it. As soon as they allowed Cuban Americans to be able to travel to the island and send more remittances to the island, and now Cubans were able to start some private businesses, all of a sudden you saw that sector just flourish.
They're hungry.
So as those opportunities open, I think that's what you got to watch out for.
That's interesting because we've talked a little bit, and I want to return to the practical hurdles, like just how do you get online if you're trying to run a business. But what about the culture? I mean, it's hard to start a business anywhere. Forget in a communist country where the whole idea of entrepreneurship completely goes against the grain of the prevailing political ethos, the way it's been for the last 50 years. How do you teach that?
That's been a challenge. I mean, we saw in 2011 the government said, well, we're now going to allow greater private enterprise inside the island. They still can't own their enterprises, but they have a license that they can operate their business, and that they make money and they can retain the profits. They have to pay taxes like everybody else, but there's a lot of folks that are making a much better living than they were many years ago in the island. But for those folks, they had to cut their teeth just by throwing themselves out there and trying to start a business.
It's not like they can small beans.
Exactly. They couldn't study business administration in school. They didn't have a lot of institutional knowledge or mom and pop, because they didn't have parents that started businesses in the island that can show them the ropes. So it's been challenging. Some of the ways to help remedy that have been entrepreneurial workshops, such as the one that the Catholic Church hosts in Havana, Cienfuegos, and Camagüey. It's called Cuba Emprende, which teaches entrepreneurs the fundamentals of running a business. So
getting on the ground and teaching business one-on-one.
So that and also just learning. You see that there is an entrepreneurial class and an entrepreneurial culture of people that become aware that they can increase their autonomy from the state and that they can make things happen on their own. It's happening in an organic way, but it's also happening thanks to the efforts of groups like Cuba Emprende.
I would add to that I think there's a very strong kind of correlation for people who have that sense of, if I gain kind of economic autonomy, that leads to other senses of political independence, so on and forth. So it leads to a sense of independence that I do think people are very tapped into. So even if they don't fully understand the logistics and the process of getting from point A to point B, there's a general drive to do so. And there is an interesting, I personally think it's fascinating to watch kind of how some of the semantics around this will evolve, because when you talk about entrepreneurship here, we're talking about, earlier someone on the stage, the moderator mentioned unicorns, right? So we're talking about, tech companies, we're talking about things at scale, we're talking about different things when we here in the United States and in Miami define kind of successful entrepreneurial growth. In Cuba, the semantics around this are very different, because they're coming from obviously a very different point of reference, but they're also trying to reach kind of their goals are very different, and the framework within which they operate is very different. So how they start to semantically kind of nuance what kind of entrepreneurship can mean for them as changes start to happen.
Can you give an example of how the vocabulary is different?
Sure. So I think some of it is vocabulary driven. Some of it is, so for example, as Rick mentioned, when there's an opening, kind of people seize it. So a lot of the openings so far have been around things like the tourism industry or food and beverage. But increasingly, those things are open to change. That could end up being communications, or a lot of the conversations that I've had are about goods and services. So for example, if there's all of a sudden going to be more other kinds of businesses popping up because that is permitted, there will be needs for things like marketing, accounting, legal services that are particularly tailored to entrepreneurs. That is not, those service sectors are not things that are currently or have ever really existed in Cuba, because there hasn't been a need. So thinking about kind of several steps ahead of what it is that they currently define as entrepreneurship and the needs that emanate from that, I think would be a very kind of particular point of inflection for how entrepreneurship develops in the island.
So talk me through what specific business opportunities you see. You mentioned tourism. I'm guessing, is that #1 in terms of where money is going to be made in Cuba in the next, say, decade?
Well, certainly, tourism is definitely a major one. Also, a lot of services that visiting families. So, you know, it's people-to-people engagement, family visits, and folks catering to the folks that are coming from outside and helping to provide, you know, they'll come in and they'll buy all sorts of goods and services for their relatives at home. That's a big part of it. But also, so within that realm, family visits, tourism, there's also the paladares, the restaurants. The restaurant industry is sort of having this renaissance in Cuba where there are very just fantastic private restaurants popping up all over the island, particularly in Havana. One of the sectors where I've seen a lot of activity that's been really interesting, considering the lack of connectivity in the island, has been in IT and in computer programming and in software development, website development.
Really?
Yeah, because they, even though you only have 5% of the population with unfettered access to the internet, you still have 25% of the population that has access to a domestic intranet. And there's a huge percentage of engineering students that learn computer programming in school that have learned to program things offline, and then when they get the opportunity to be you know, somewhere where they have internet access, they load it up. So that's one thing that's been interesting, because I know of ventures here in Miami and other parts of the country that have had their websites programmed by developers in Cuba for something that is, you know, for a website that's launched here in the United States.
And then nobody in Cuba can look at it,
Yeah.
but the technology.
And I know the opposite, so I can think of entrepreneurs in Cuba who tell me, I'm like, what do you do? They're like, well, I have a, you know, my actual job, and then on the side I have a startup that deals with technology and kind of software development. So even just hearing someone, you know, who might know my equivalent in age, who lives in Havana, tell me they have a startup that deals with something related to technology, that already is very fascinating. So I echo Ric's thoughts that there are certain kind of industry verticals that have historically, or by historically I mean the last, let's say, like 5 to 10 years, been the areas where most of this kind of gray activity is happening, that now is going to hopefully turn, or it has been turning, more kind of above board. Obviously tourism, good, you know, food and beverage and so forth, but especially the element of technology and kind of the tech space. You're talking about a very well-capacitated workforce, surprisingly well-capacitated workforce,
right,
as far as the STEM fields go. So it leads to people being perhaps a lot more ready and willing and intrigued and interested and able to develop on some of these technological kind of ideas than perhaps than one would think.
Now, I don't know if you would want to call the elephant in the room, but there is, you know, when you look at the political situation there, it's not always entirely clear where the Castros are going to take the country and quite when and how much freedom will be allowed as these economic changes are underway. Do we know, does anybody know, you know, as VC money starts flowing in, does that help the regime? Does it hurt the regime? How far are they willing to let entrepreneurship flourish, our free press, or any of the other changes that many Americans would like to see?
I mean, I think as long as that system stays in place, the money that pours in, is a good chunk of it is going to eventually end up in the coffers of the government. It's inevitable. That's how the system was designed. But what's important here is, in the process, how that money touches the individual Cubans, right? If by bringing in money into the island, you're helping a paladar owner, you're helping somebody with a computer repair shop or a barber shop or any sort of service provider thrive, if you're helping them increase their independence from the state, I think it's something that's worthwhile
in and of itself.
At the end.
Right.
Also, you have to, one thing that's going to be interesting how this plays out is, you know, Cuba for a long time has said that it aspires to achieve a prosperous and sustainable socialism, right? For the folks that are still running the show, the operative word there has been socialism. And they have been very reluctant to open up, because they know that every time they open up any sector of that society, it means that they're relinquishing control to some degree over that part. And they haven't been too keen on that. However, there is this growing, you know, the ranks, there are ranks within the government, and pretty much every sector of civil society is really focused more on the prosperous and sustainable part of that equation. And they realize that in order to actually have social innovation, in order to really have a prosperous society, you need to liberalize. You need to open up. You need to have inclusive and independent political and economic institutions growing in the island. And so you see a lot more receptivity to those sorts of concepts pretty much everywhere other than at the top. And really, let's think about the folks on the top. Fidel's not really involved in the day-to-day anymore. He's been enjoying his retirement now, 10 years in. Raul Castro has announced that he's going to retire in 2018, and no one really thinks that he's going to want to stay there a day longer.
Sounds like you've got your eye on the clock. Wait them out, and if other changes can happen in
exactly.
the meantime,
so I think
there
is already a transition in place. I think it is much smarter for us to try to play a constructive role in the present of Cuba and trying to influence that to whatever degree possible, as opposed to just sitting on the sidelines and hoping that the best will turn out to be the case.
Natalia, let me ask you what the risks are here. What scares you? And as an example, many critics of re-engagement with Cuba will point to China, will point to Vietnam as examples of places where the US has reestablished relations. They now have more Starbucks than they used to. They have better access to Coca-Cola products. They don't necessarily have access to many more freedoms of speech or other democratic ideals that we would like to see. As you watch Cuba go through this process, what are the things that you worry about?
So I would say, my answer to that is kind of paired with the answer to the previous question for me. Overall, we're looking at something that really has been an intractable conflict. When you look at the study of conflict in general, intractable conflicts do not respond to the same interventions and the same processes that regular conflicts do, even though we kind of equate them as being such. This has been an intractable conflict for a number of decades. So no matter you look at the degree of ambiguity here and the degree of things that have yet to be defined and the many, many ways that this could go terribly wrong in every possible scenario, overall, I still think it's at the moment a win that there was a shock to the system that was significant enough that potentially the parameters of the system itself can change. So I believe that. Aside from that, to me, one of the biggest risks is really kind of what you mentioned in your earlier question. So money starting to come in, there's obviously a lot of interest, there has been a lot of interest, but money starting to come in a way that is somewhat indiscriminate and to a certain degree kind of not focused on sustainability and on responsible practice. I view, one of the things kind of piggybacking off of what Rick said, there's an imperative not just from the kind of moral angle, but also from the investment angle for entities that are investing or looking to invest or partner in some format with Cuba to lobby, and I mean lobby both with like a capital L and lobby with a lowercase l, for particular things that are important to them, whether that be kind of a legal framework that allows them to operate kind of with certain trust and consistency, or a banking system that allows them to interact, again, with certain trust and consistency, access to the internet, kind of X, Y, and Z, or being able, for example, to hire, if you're an entity that wants to open an office, or not related to terms necessarily, in Cuba, having the right and the ability to hire your own employees as opposed to having to go through the state agency. And these are things that are substantial changes, and they're not going to necessarily come if we just expect them to magically appear from the Cuba side. They will, however, be much more likely to come if entities that are coming into the island kind of with purpose and with funds are asking for them on a consistent basis.
These are high standards, though, you're putting out there. Again, just to emphasize the practical challenge of 9 out of 10 Cubans aren't online, they don't have cell phones, the red tape that you deal with. You must deal with this, talking to people who are trying to start businesses, whether it's Americans going into Cuba or Cubans trying to do it on the ground there. Just, is the experience kind of butting your head up against a wall right now, trying to get this done in Cuba?
It's going to be a daunting challenge.
Yeah.
You have 50 years of conflict, of restrictions, of sanctions, of animosity, of distrust in the table, plus all this underdevelopment that we have seen in the island. But I repeat, I think we need to explore it now that we are opening up, and they are also in some sectors opening up too. We have to explore every opportunity that we can to help empower the people, to put more resources and more information and more capital in their hands, so that they can also demand greater changes. They will be in a better position to demand greater changes from that government. So absolutely, seize every opportunity as they open up. And it's going to be difficult, but I think it's worth it.
Let me open it up to some questions out here from our audience. Yes, ma'am, right here.
Hi, I'm Tereska Line. I'm the president of Aurora Executive Consulting. Historically, and certainly most recently, Miami Cubans have been the biggest obstacle to having diplomatic relations with Cuba. To what extent do you feel that this city will unfortunately be the biggest obstacle in creating startup opportunities in Cuba? Thank you.
What's ironic is that we still have a political class that is still very much sort of dominated by folks who believe that there should be no opening to Cuba. towards Cuba, but it's not reflective of the community at large. If you've seen poll after poll over the last 10 years has shown that the community has lost faith in the embargo, has increasingly embraced engagement to varying degree as a better form of promoting change in the island. And as a matter of fact, all the entrepreneurship activity that's taking place in Cuba now, lots of it is occurring thanks to Miami. I mean, there's over 490,000 licensed entrepreneurs operating the island. A good bulk of them get their seed capital from friends and family here, what we often refer to as the Bank of Hialeah, right? There are, I mean, Miami and Havana are natural sister cities that are developing border town characteristics because of their growing social economic ties. There are all sorts of retail stores here that are largely dependent on sales to Cuba. Right now, school uniforms for Cuba's communist schools are sold here in Miami, and then the relatives send them to their family in the island. So the Uneritos can have clean clothes because obviously the government can't provide for them anymore. Lada parts for Soviet vehicles, Soviet cars are sold here. There are tons of clothing stores and others that cater to the taste and preferences of Cubans in the island and Cubans that live with one foot on each shore. So to a large degree, Miami's driving this. Now the question is, will we continue to be at the tip of the spear, or we're going to let politics get in the way of greater change?
Well, although our questioner makes a great point, which is that, for many people, the politics is the point. And Natalia, let me let you jump in here and ask, this isn't a one-way street of American capital and interest going in. Is Miami ready for the outflux of products and services and ideas coming out of Cuba?
Well, I think we have to be. I mean, I don't really think it's a matter of whether or not we are. I think it's coming, and so we kind of have to buckle up and deal with it and find a constructive and purposeful way of engaging with it. I agree with Rick that I think Miami stands to be, I think we are already, but stands to be really the most substantive ally in this process, as much as we have been kind of a wishy-washy ally or sometimes not an ally, depending on how you define that. I think we stand to be that, but particularly because we have the context. So aside from understanding the economic drives, the political complexities, we have a historical kind of understanding and attachment. We have a very different relationship, obviously, with the island because of our population here and our history here. So we are at that intersection of wanting kind of prosperity, wanting growth, wanting economic success for ourselves as well as for Cuba, but we also understand kind of the complexities of the system, the moral obligations. We have a sense of responsibility, perhaps, for that kind of success. And I think at that intersection is where you will get the kind of change, you will lead forward the kind of change and the kind of progress that we actually want. And so I would urge for Miami to be that kind of ally.
Yeah, if I can add, a lot of business leaders here in this community also have recognized that a lot of Miami's core competencies are in exactly the industries where Cuba needs the most work right now: construction, tourism, transport, logistics, infrastructure building. These are software, tech, IT. These are areas where we have a lot of expertise and can provide a lot of know-how for the folks back home in Cuba, and that business leaders here are looking at closely and looking to see how they can help.
One more quick question over here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Eldridge Birmingham. I'm the Chief Science Officer at Frost Science. And Natalia touched on this, but I wanted you to amplify a little bit. In my own experience, which is fairly extensive both in Cuba and Latin America, the education system is absolutely tremendous. And I think, Natalia, you mentioned STEM in particular. So as you look forward, I see great hope in Cuba because of the education of the Cubans. And I wondered if you want to comment a little bit more on that.
Sure. Well, I mean, in my experience, one of the things that has been most rewarding is dealing with people who are constantly frustrated, constantly stressed, are lacking the information that they need, would like different textbooks, would like different things, but are extremely hungry for it in a way that I really respect. And so when I talk to people who are kind of computer programmers there, or who are computer programmers here that just came from the island, they're functioning, I mean, they're very willing, they understand that they don't have access to all the information that they want, but they're looking for ways to find it, both kind of within the institutional context of their organizations as well as outside through friends or family members or entities, people that send them that content. but they're hungry to be capacitated. They are capacitating themselves very actively, which to me is a huge sign of kind of hope and optimism, because I do feel like they're doing that already within very restricted situations that are definitely rigged against them. And so if some of that kind of rigging starts to fall apart or starts to be taken away purposefully, I can only imagine kind of some of that blossoming that would happen. So that gives me optimism.
I'm very optimistic as to the future of Cuba because of some of the conditions you have there right now. You do have this great percentage of students people with engineering degrees, with science degrees, thanks to the current system of education that they have inside the island. You also have some of the more exciting artists and designers living in Cuba today in the hemisphere. There is a profound respect in the society for both the sciences, the arts, and for social responsibility. When I look at all that, I see the base ingredients for a future knowledge economy. So all it takes is opening up and getting along a little better.
We need to wrap. It sounds like the parting words of advice you would have
that's
both
the best wrap up we could have had.
here and in Havana would be seize the day. Is that pretty much the parting shot?
Yeah, I think my parting shot is think broadly, because conditions are changing. And if you've been used to functioning within a very restrictive set of conditions, it's hard to really map out the very broad possibilities of what could come. And right now it's a big period of ambiguity. So don't just, I think entrepreneurs in general need to do that, but I think specifically in Cuba, it's map out options, map out a lot of options, and hedge for all of them.
Great, all right. Natalia Martinez, Ric Herrero, thank you both so much. Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
There we go.
That wraps up our morning's programming. Grab a bite, take a seat outside, and meet some new people. We'll be back at 12:45.